Dear friends, welcome to another broadcast. I hope you're all doing well. Today, we'll seek answers to crucial questions. Is NATO expanding into the Asia-Pacific region? Will Japan and South Korea become new NATO members? Would you be surprised if I said the US spends the least on NATO defense? Does Trump aim to make other NATO members finance a potential US-China showdown? The old world is crumbling, and a new one is attempting to establish itself. Is Trump a harbinger of peace for this new world, or a herald of world war? Yes, we will search for answers to these questions. Donald Trump came to power promising to prevent world war. However, looking at his performance over the past 6 months, he resembles a warmongering president more than a peace advocate. His actions in Ukraine and Gaza have been quite bloody. He didn't end the wars, but instead fueled their fires. On top of that, he initiated the Israel-Iran war and became the first American president to bomb Iranian territory. If you're not satisfied with Trump's performance so far, you won't be pleased with his future plans at all. This is because Trump is preparing the United States and the entire world for world war. He is preparing to transform NATO from an organization solely responsible for European defense into a global army. In other words, Trump himself is currently the biggest organizer of armaments and war. The most significant sign of this was the decision to increase NATO defense spending to 5% of GDP. Trump has stated for years that America has been defending NATO members without compensation, often criticizing, "We are defending you for free, and you're just lying on your backs and enjoying yourselves." According to him, while the United States spends approximately 3.3 to 3.4% of its national income on defense and military expenditures, this varies annually, the remaining NATO members weren't even spending 2% of their national income on defense. Over the past 76 years, America has indeed made significant contributions to the functioning of the NATO alliance through its troops, bases, intelligence, logistics, and nuclear weapons. This is certainly true. However, there's a miscalculation made by Trump and many others. The United States defense spending in 2024 was $997 billion annually. In 2025, Congress approved a reduction of $100 billion, so let's say it's approximately $900 billion. The total defense spending of NATO members, excluding America, in 2024 was $506 billion. This means that while America spends almost $1 trillion, the rest of the NATO members combined spend $506 billion. $480 billion of this belongs to European countries. Looking at these figures, you might assume there's a huge disparity between the defense spending of the United States and Europe. However, European countries allocate these funds solely for the security of the European continent and the North Atlantic. In other words, Europe's defense spending is primarily aimed at Russia and covers the European continent and the North Atlantic, the Arctic Pole. The Arctic Pole is also primarily seen as a defense area against Russia, so European NATO members spend approximately $500 billion for a very specific and confined area. Looking at the American side, the United States defense budget averages around $900 billion. But Americans don't spend this budget solely on the NATO region. While Europeans spend $500 billion to defend the European continent and its vicinity, the United States spends $900 billion for its interests worldwide. The US defense budget, beyond Europe and the North Atlantic, also covers Africa, the Middle East, the rest of Asia, Central and South America, the Indian Ocean, the Asia-Pacific region, and the South Pole Antarctica. Roughly speaking, the American defense budget, including the NATO region, covers at least 8 major regions. From this perspective, perhaps only 1/10 of the US military's active operations are within the NATO region. You cannot consider America's activities in the Middle East, for example, Yemen or Iran, as NATO activities. Therefore, we need to examine where America spends this money. A rough estimate suggests that the US spent between $900 billion and $1 trillion on defense in 2024, but perhaps only $100 billion or generously $200 billion, was allocated to the NATO region. On the other hand, European NATO countries primarily focus their spending on the NATO region, and their expenditures in this area are at least 2.5 times that of America's. For instance, countries like Italy, Spain, or Portugal entirely dedicate their defense expenditures to European security and, unlike the United States, do not spend their military funds in the Pacific or Indian Ocean. In fact, these countries are quite far from Russia's land borders. Therefore, it's not surprising that they spend less of their national income on defense. At the most recent NATO summit in The Hague, it was decided, under Trump's threats and blackmail, to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, despite the original target being 2%. In this context, all NATO members will first ensure their defense spending reaches 3% of their national income, and immediately thereafter, 5%. This means if a NATO country earns 100 liras, 5 liras will be spent on weapons, soldiers, and ammunition. Trump claims, "I already spend 3.5% of my income on defense. Therefore, as America, we don't need to increase defense spending for the first few years." On the other hand, countries like Germany, Italy, and Turkey will be forced to double their defense spending. However, as we calculated earlier, America isn't making the necessary expenditures for NATO defense. It's presenting its spending in other regions as NATO defense. Trump pushed hard in The Hague to avoid losing America and to appease Trump. Europeans agreed to increase their defense budgets to 5% of their national income. Over the next 5 to 6 years, Europeans, including the British, Germans, and French, will cut from healthcare, education, and social aid, redirecting those funds to weapons and ammunition. The public is already dissatisfied with the economic situation. This will place a greater burden on classes with reduced purchasing power. People will be forced to make sacrifices and tighten their belts. After decades of peace, European populations won't want to pay these bills. There's a potential for significant public discontent. Therefore, the fear of Russia is being actively propagated. The narrative is, if we don't pay this money, the Russian army could reach Berlin and Paris within a few years. What did the German Chancellor say recently? He stated, "Protecting the Baltic is like protecting Berlin." He emphasized the proximity of this danger, implying that if the Baltic isn't protected, the Russian army will reach Berlin. Governments from Finland to Germany are busy building bunkers and preparing their citizens for war. Chiefs of staff, intelligence chiefs, ministers, and prime ministers are talking about doubling their defense budgets as if Russia will attack tomorrow, stating they will build Europe's largest army. They even discuss the necessity of reinstating compulsory military service. Denmark has even decided to conscript women, as you know. As we've said before, if you talk about something so much, if you buy so many weapons, if you produce so much ammunition, unexpected things will happen. In other words, if there are so many guns on stage, they will eventually go off. Some people say Trump is a harbinger of peace. Believe me, I laugh at those words. Supposedly, Trump came to end wars? Would a person who wants to end wars ensure a 150% increase in military spending, and not even in his own country? I'm talking about NATO allies. During the Biden era, the United States scared Europe with Russia, leading to huge increases in defense budgets. And orders for weapons and ammunition from American firms to Europe skyrocketed. The Poles, Germans, and Belgians all lined up. Everyone currently wants to buy Patriots. If you were to take out your money today to buy a Patriot air defense system, and America gave the go-ahead, even with cash up front, you could only get a Patriot 2, 3, or even 5 years later. The queue is... the same applies to F-35 fighter jets. Put down the money, let Congress approve it, let America approve it. They can't immediately give you an F-35. How many years later can you get it? Such a queue formed during the Biden era. When Trump became president, he didn't abandon this policy. On the contrary, he upped the ante. He threatened to abandon the Europeans. He said, "You will buy weapons, you will buy ammunition, and you will buy it from me." How much are you spending today? You're spending 10. That's not enough. You'll spend 35, and you'll buy the planes from me, the ammunition from me. A country spending $20 billion on defense today will have to increase its budget to $50 to $60 billion in a few years. A country spending $50 billion today will have to increase its spending to $125 billion in a few years. Look, France, the UK, Germany, each of them will become countries spending at least $100 billion on defense. The three of them will spend close to $300 billion. So, where will they spend over $250 billion? On weapons, ammunition, killing. When we calculate this for all of Europe within a very short period, 3 to 5 years, Europe's defense spending, currently around $500 billion, will soon increase to $1.25 trillion. And that's in today's money. If you calculate it with the income of 5, 6, 7 years from now, this figure could reach $1.5 trillion and even more. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you in the next broadcast. Take good care of yourselves. Goodbye.